Palestine. For centuries, this had been a remote and desolate corner of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, with only a small Jewish community. Then in the late 19th and early 20th century, this land saw the arrival of a new breed of Jewish settler. They were young and idealistic, from Russia and the countries of Eastern Europe. They came to establish agrarian settlements to start what they dreamed would become a new Jewish nation. They called themselves Zionists.
I was born in Palestine. My father came here just over 100 years ago from Russia. My mother came here immediately after the end of World War I. They met in the valley of Jezreel in a kibbutz and had me. I had nothing to do with it.
In the early 1920s, Palestine was largely desolate and arid. Its sparse population numbered only a few 100,000. Most Arabs lived in the hilly regions. The coastal plain and the valleys were deserted. The Jezreel Valley, the largest of all, was almost entirely a swamp, infested with malaria-bearing mosquitoes. The pioneers considered the restoration of the Jezreel Valley as the greatest challenge of Zionism. The dream of the pioneers to transform the land of Israel into one great kibbutz, a social paradise, was only partially realized. Not everyone was able to accept the burden of collective life. What remains of the dream are some 280 prospering kibbutzim, which developed in spite of all who said that such a way of life could not last.
In the 1920s, Jewish immigration increased. In the 1930s, Jewish towns were growing steadily.
From 1933 on, ships sailing for Palestine were packed to capacity. The passengers, Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany and Poland, in which anti-Semitic attacks were taking place as well, never imagined that it would be under these circumstances that they would fulfill the promise of next year in Jerusalem. Tel Aviv, which in 1931 was a provincial township with fewer than 50,000 inhabitants, now became a modern metropolis with a population of 150,000. A new generation was growing up in the country, for whom Hebrew was the obvious, natural, everyday language. Children celebrated the holidays of the Bible as though the nation had never been uprooted from its land. The people who had forgotten their language and abandoned their culture throughout the diaspora, the assimilating, disintegrating Jewish nation, once said to be dying, now rose to life once again.
The Arabs of Palestine were now growing restless, frustrated by continuing British rule, angered by continuing Jewish immigration. In the 30s, there were riots and sporadic outbreaks of violence against both the Jews and the British authorities.
I was 16 then, at the agricultural school, and after a short time of training, we assumed guard duties on the perimeter of the school. And when I was 16, it was my first firefight with Arabs, with friends of mine being wounded and dead, schoolboys like me. And it went on to this day.
During these days of anguish for the Jewish people, the Jews of Palestine displayed surprising vitality. Every 2 to 3 weeks, a convoy of trucks laden with prefabricated houses would make its way to one of the country's desolate regions. The objective? To complete construction of a new village within one day.
memory of 1939 was I volunteered, and I volunteered in the summer recess to join a kibbutz which was moving into a new location by a system at that time called tower and wall system, in which there was a sort of a scaffolding work, tower, wood tower, for observation, and a wall made at that particular place from old ruins. My job there was to guard at night around the perimeter, and I decided to work a day on a new tractor which they had just received. But when plowing it, up came pieces of marble with script, old Hebrew script, which for me was a great discovery, and I felt connection with the old times. So for me it was sort of the same line. My father's family coming here when the Turks were ruling the country, and I am plowing the old fields.
In 1939, the curtain descended on the world of yesterday, the world of Talmudic academies and great sages, the world of Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, the Baal Shem Tov, and that marvelous Rabbi, Rabbi who dared to voice a protest to God Almighty, as if foreseeing the impending awesome disaster that would befall the Jewish people. 9 out of every 10 children shown in this film died because in 1939 there was not one nation in the world who wanted to give them a home.
I remember the press conference. Rupin was there, and so was I, although to this day I still don't know why. We were together, and I remember saying that I hope to live to see the day when no one will have to pity the Jews. I felt that pity was the most the Jews could ever hope to obtain in their hour of need.
This Israeli generation belonged to a different world than that of their fathers. Their image of themselves was as clear as the summer sun and just as uncomplicated. From the beginning, the Jews
I decided to join the British Army once they said they are open to volunteers as soon as I'm 18. That was after finishing school. Parents like mine, for instance, who were kibbutz members before, and the main theme of talk in the house was Zionism. No parents dared to deny the children to do these things, even if they were against it. Yes, they volunteered to go to be Palmach members, Haganah members, and some died.
The biggest bestseller since Gone with the Wind, read by more than 50 million around the world, now on the screen. An epic of our time, The Birth of a Nation. With Paul Newman as Ari Ben Canaan, Eva Marie Saint as Kitty Fremont, Ralph Richardson as General Sutherland. Time magazine says, a terrific show. A serious, expert, frightening, and inspiring thriller.
You heard what I said! Fight! Not beg! Fight!
During the early days of the war, the Jewish agency started recruitment campaigns for the British Army. Volunteers marched through the streets of Tel Aviv calling for the setting up of a Jewish fighting force. Fearing an Arab reaction, the British were prepared to recruit the Jews only on an individual basis.
I joined the British Army in the summer 1940. My serial number was preceded by PAL, Palestine. My serial number was 570, I was among the first to join up here. Palestine contingent in the British Army. That's what it was. Later in the war, the infantry part of them were grouped in a brigade group, flying the Israeli flag. It was not very easy to be in the British Army, not being British. And anybody not British as a black bastard. That's the way they said it. Even if you were blonde.
Oh, I don't care about the Jews one way or the other. But they are troublemakers, aren't they?
They look funny, too.
I can spot one a mile away.
Do you mind looking into my eye, sir? It feels like a cinder.
Certainly. You know, a lot of them try to hide under Gentile names. But one look at that face.
But we went to the war with Hitler, not with King George VI, who was my sovereign. They were training us in Egypt. We went to Libya, and this North African war, back and forth, took 3 years.
In North Africa, the tide turned against the British when the German army arrived with powerful new weapons, commanded by the brilliant tactician General Erwin Rommel. June the 20th, Rommel makes his final attack. The Germans charge in from all directions. In 24 hours, Tobruk surrenders. There was nothing now to prevent the Germans from pushing all the way to Egypt, and beyond Egypt lay the defenseless Jewish homeland.
In 1941, I've been in one of the worst places of the war. That was the siege of Tobruk in Libya. The spring and summer 1941, we were besieged by the Germans. The power balance was to the Germans' favor. They had 1-200 number of planes and tanks. We were besieged there, an Australian division, a few British units, and us. It was hard, it was dangerous. For 6 months I never washed. No water, hardly enough water for tea, and you can imagine British without tea. Some of us lost their nerves under such heavy air attacks and artillery bombardments. Some people lost their nerves. They had to be discharged. What were the odds? When Jews were slaughtered by the million, what difference does it make another Jew? During the first retreat in Libya, 1941, they asked for volunteers to try to help to extricate a surrounded Australian infantry battalion. Only us, Palestinians, stood up for that. And we arranged a convoy to get to them. We drove about 300 kilometers behind the lines, got them out. I succeeded shooting down one German dive bomber. I did it with a British abandoned tank, which I went to play there and write letters to my girlfriend, sitting inside the tank because it was safer. It was completely gone, rusty. The gun still worked, the cannon. And one shot, I got a plane. So I have one German dive bomber to my credit.
In the spring of 1944, Churchill ordered the formation of a Jewish brigade. He declared It seems to me indeed appropriate that a special Jewish unit of that race which has suffered indescribable torment from the Nazis should be represented as a distinct formation among the forces gathered for their final overthrow. The Jewish Brigade Group saw its first action in the rugged terrain of Italy as part of the British Eighth Army.
And the war in Italy was as ferocious as everywhere else, even worse. The first winter there was bloody awful, as the British would say. I told you before, I was seconded to the American 12th Army, and we spent in the mountains minus 12 degrees in the winter with no winter uniform. The part of Italy that was ruined we were in, because the battle went there, going slowly crawling up north, more or less as far as Florence. The minute the war ended, we, the Palestinian soldiers, burst in through the lines to look out for survivors. We spread all over Europe looking for survivors.
This vast migration of survivors was organized without reference to the occupying American and British armies. The Jewish Brigade devoted all its efforts to rescuing its fellow Jews.
I am trying to save a Jewish child. Can't you understand that? Don't you have any respect for human life?
Now, don't expect me to get hysterical over the life of one Jewish child, and don't you get hysterical either. You're late. Lady, you're 10 years late. Almost 2 million Jewish children were butchered like animals because nobody wanted them. No country would have them, not your country or any other country. And nobody wants the ones who survived.
We went everywhere in Europe, under all guises. It was really dangerous.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing.
Most difficult for soldiers returning from the war. You know, believing they'll never touch a gun again. Enough is enough. I met in Cairo another Israeli girl, a girl soldier in the British Army. And I went to her village and we got married. And immediately they took me as an instructor in the Haganah. So there was never a real lull. Working on the farm as much as I could, working in the Haganah, then the Arabs started immediately after the UN resolution. Next day, the war started, in fact, and that was it. The last time I did reserve service was 2 weeks ago.